Welcome back to Political Science 101 or History 101, the history of the American political system. We are on Chapter 8 and this is Part 3. We are discussing why people vote as they do. And our chapter title is Public Opinion and Voting. And we are on Chapter 8. So we're talking about party identification on page 178. Very interesting why people vote the way they do. What different groups vote differently, when things change, when they switch, that sort of thing. I want to bring your attention to page 179. This is really interesting. It says in 2012, it's talking about perceptions of candidates. 2012, for example, Tea Party backed Republicans in Missouri and Indiana looked like sure bets to gain Senate seats. Missouri's Todd Akin, however, made the mistake of claiming that women cannot become pregnant as a result of a legitimate rape. This was an old wives' tale. I had heard it, actually had believed it for many, many years. But something that has really changed me as a historian is I look at factual things. I look up and see the facts. I want the footnotes. I want the, I don't just want society's wives' tales. So this is something that really hurt women in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. If you claimed rape and then you had a baby, just society decided that there was no real rape because they felt that if you fought it off, that a pregnancy could not occur. It was very interesting. I was actually in a class, history class, when this scientific information came to light that it was not true, that, pregnancy can happen regardless. So that was a huge, huge issue because I believe this happened the same time scientific evidence said, no, that's not true. So that was just really interesting. But that's why it's so careful. You have to be so careful to do research on your own because there's so many stereotypes that are floating around out there. Policy choices, a lot of it, social issues, and social class, socioeconomic factors, which is your social class, it pertains to how you vote. And of course we know, especially for this campaign season, some of the most heated debates in American politics are around these social issues, such as abortion, gay rights and lesbian rights, death penalty, and religion within schools. The more education someone has, the more often or the more likely they are to vote. And I just saw a huge documentary on how being poor is truly a barrier to education. So the more poor the person, the more difficult it is to get that education, which I know it seems like a no-brainer, but it just to get them out of poverty, education is the way out. Teaching in an inner city school for many years, I believe it was 6 or 7 years, those kids knew. They knew the only way out was through education. And that's if they had the talent to be educated or the support to be educated from home. So really could see that when I taught in the inner city school. Your occupation and your income, they go through each thing. Business persons tend to vote Republican. Okay, higher the income, more likely would vote Republican. However, what's really interesting, in previous chapters, they've talked about with the technology businesses, the technology heads or the technology owners, like Facebook, for example, Mark Zuckerberg, are more coming out and they're being more Democratic voters. Okay. Age, really good, interesting stuff on age. Gender, the gender gap, the modern feminist movement and recognition that women have suffered from various types of discrimination doubtless have something to do with the gender gap. It appears, however, that compared with men, women on average have a stronger commitment to the liberal values. As you know, there's been many waves of feminism. You have the first wave of feminism, second wave, the third wave of feminism. Really interesting study on that. and gender issues. Religion and ethnic background, regular church attendance, minority groups. This is always a question that is brought up in class when I teach face-to-face class. And that is, when did the African American vote change from Republican and Abraham Lincoln to Democrat? And the answer really is on page 181, as noted in chapter 7. It happened when FDR was in office. And you have to understand, in the Great Depression, everyone was very poor and destitute. Well, not everyone. Many poor, destitute. But when you take the minority groups, they're even more poor and destitute. And so they really changed with the New Deal and FDR because the government stepped in and aided them in a time where, there was starvation and just devastating poverty. All right. What I found very interesting under Muslim Americans is in the year 2000, on page 182, a majority of Muslims of Middle Eastern background voted for Republican presidential candidate George W. Bush. Because if you've spoken to Muslims, and I had a few in class with me, I've spoken to some at different yoga classes and that sort of thing, they're very conservative. Many of them don't even drink alcohol. They're extremely, extremely conservative. So they really lined up with the Republicans for quite some time. But this has switched. Muslims are mostly Democratic now because of the anti-Muslim campaigns that certain conservative groups appear to be a major cause for this transformation. So they used to vote with this group, and then they vote opposite because of the anti-Muslim agendas for some different groups. Geographic regions, you have the swing states, you have, solid, mostly solid Democrat states, mostly Republican states, and different swing states. Okay. Right. Why do people vote? Why don't they vote? And they really tackle that question. A lot of times it's because they don't know enough about it. All right. And it does cover that, in the past, legal restrictions based on income, gender, race, and other factors kept a number of people from voting. But now only 55% in presidential elections vote that could vote. So 45% are not voting. 55% are. 40% do not feel it's their duty to vote. 70% of the non-voters say they did not vote because they lacked information on the candidates. And many of them don't believe that their vote will make a difference. When I taught inner city, I did notice that there was a large number of students who would mention, I wouldn't ask, but would mention that their parents do not vote. And I would say things like, get your parents to vote, encourage them. And I would not ask them if they voted or not, because I don't really think that's my place. But I would say, encourage your parents to vote. Many of my students would say, well, I'm going to tell my mom or dad that if you're going to complain, you need to vote. And if you are going to complain, then don't complain if you didn't vote. So I really liked how the kids were kind of spurring their parents onto voting as we were learning about voting and that sort of thing. All right, now we have one of our history analysis words, democratization, one of my favorite words. Now, the opposite of democratization is hierarchy. And of course, we know what hierarchy is. It's where you have maybe the king at the top, like in the Middle Ages, and then you might have lords and princes, and then you might have knights, and then you have the serfs or the peasants, or they're pretty much nobodies. They do all the work. There was no movement. There was no ability to move up the ladder. You stayed in your place in your hierarchy, and you really didn't get to move up. You stayed where you were, and your rights were very, very few if you were a serf. If you lived on a manor, you stayed there. So a hierarchy. Well, this is the opposite. This is democratization. What I love about democratization is it is a leveling of the playing field. So no matter what your race, gender, sexual orientation, your age, your ethnicity, it's supposed to be equal in the United States. Now, obviously, we know that it isn't, that there still are some huge problems that need to be dealt with. But that is the aim and the goal, democratization. And they're talking about the legal right to vote, suffrage. It is, and I love this quote, expanding the right to vote has been an important part of the gradual democratization of the American electoral process. So democratization is in this chapter. All right. Obviously, when the Constitution was written, it left power to suffrage, or the right to vote, to individual states. The 15th Amendment in 1870 guaranteed voting to African American males. Yet, if you really do your research, in the South, they were denied the ability to exercise their votes on many stipulations, loopholes, ways to get around the law, especially in the South, using methods ranging from mob violence to economic pressure. Groups of white Southerners kept Black Americans from voting for close to 100 years after the Civil War. If you read about, and I probably mentioned this several times, it's just so fascinating to me. If you read about Rosa Parks, she had a college degree. She was the NAACP secretary. She took the literary exam to vote 3 times and failed. They wouldn't let her vote. And then she finally passed. So it wasn't about her ability. It was that they did not want her to vote. So she was denied. And that was in the 60s. Okay, so literacy tests are mentioned in your book. Poll tax, which if you're poor, having more money to have to pay to vote isn't going to happen. It discouraged African American voters as well as white poor. Grandfather clause was a nightmare. The grandfather clause restricted voting rights to those whose ancestors had voted before 1860. That means no slave at all could vote. None. Zero. Because all of their ancestors were slaves before then. This technique was prohibited by the United States Supreme Court in 1915. Oh my goodness. So 1860s, the grandfather clause. And then not until 1915 was it done away with. Okay. The white primary, another voting barrier. African Americans were prohibited from voting in Democratic primary elections due to color. And that's just, seems ridiculous to us now, but we need to evaluate what we're doing now that is stipulating and keeping people from equal rights. And there are things. Voting rights today, of course, women got the right to vote in 1920. In 1971, the 26th Amendment reduced the minimum voting age to 18. Okay. Another requirement is citizenship. And this is really interesting. Several states allowed non-citizens to vote if they lived there for so long. Also, felons cannot vote. And that's a really interesting question. When you've done your time, should you get the right to vote again? That really is, I'd like to hear both sides on that story. Very much so. Okay. And they actually have all this on 187 about felons and the right to vote. Again, it reiterates more education, the more likely you are to vote. The older individuals, older citizens vote more often. Okay. Also, you have to understand they're already registered. So it's easier for them to vote because they voted, the same place over and over again, usually. Okay. All right, and that is the rest of the chapter. It has some wonderful public opinion and voting issues on page 190 about the overwhelming incarceration of Black Americans. And what are they given the opportunities for education and a way out? Number one, incarceration country is the U.S.